Hi, I'm Lillian, welcome back to my channel Ink & Pages. Today I'm going to be doing a wrap up of the 6 books I finished this spring, starting with volume 3 of Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This is a sci-fi graphic novel series about this intergalactic war, and there are 2 people who are on opposing sides but have fallen in love and just had a baby together. Now, the previous volume had finished with a really great ending, a really good cliffhanger, I thought, so I was excited to see how this volume would go and even if it would be able to match up. However, most of this is actually a prolonged flashback to before that moment, and then we get to see all the events actually building up to it. Now, I didn't love that at first as a narrative technique because we just got to this really great moment and I wanted to see what would happen after it. And I was also worried that if we went back in time and focused on other events building up to this moment, then by the time we got to that point in the narrative again, it just wouldn't be as impactful. But luckily by the time we got there, I did appreciate it and I did enjoy the new content this volume provided. And I also really liked how it just continued to expand the world, not so far as going like wider and introducing new characters or plots or locations, but actually by going deeper on what was already there. The one thing I actually strongly disliked from this volume is the trope of like 2 characters falling in love after knowing each other for a couple of weeks. I'm like, you've literally known him a fortnight, it's not that deep. And one thing I loved was, again, the character of Lion Cat. But now having finished volume 3, it does feel like kind of the opening act of this series and the story as a whole has wrapped up, and I'm still having a really good time and I rated this 3 stars. After that, I read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, which I know is a very popular book, and to quote from my reading journal, "What the fuck is this book? Truly one of the worst things I've read in a long time." This is a fantasy story about a girl called Violet who goes to this magical military university to learn how to be a dragon rider. So yeah, this was my least favorite book that I've read in many, many years. I don't have anything groundbreaking to say about it, anything new and negative. All of my thoughts have been said before. Specifically, there's a really good video from the channel My Name is Marina's, where she goes into all of the problems I also had with this book, but much more eloquently and better than I ever could. So I'll put the link to that in the description. But to sum up my issues, the characters, the world building, the story, and the writing were awful. This truly had nothing going for it. I mean, the characters were so stupid. They never acted or spoke or thought or behaved like real people ever would. The world building was so ridiculous. It was almost laughable. I mean, things were definitely happening in the story, but that does not a good plot make. And this started off as like the very mediocre 2-star book I was hoping for and just got worse and worse and worse as it progressed, to the point where like the last few chapters I was actively dreading it. So why did I even read this? Literally just because my sister had, and she also knew that it wasn't my thing and I probably wouldn't enjoy it, but I thought I'd still have a fun time reading it and then discussing it with her, and we exchanged a lot of voice notes, and like that actually was quite fun, which was really the only saving grace of the entire experience because I was having such a bad time with this book. I listened to the audiobook of this on Spotify and was doing like jigsaw puzzles at the same time, and I love doing jigsaw puzzles, and that experience was ruined by how bad this book was. Everyone just says, oh, it gets better, you know, get to the end, there's a really good ending, there's a really great twist. There was not. There was what could have been a major twist if it hadn't been incredibly obvious from literally chapter 1, and there was also in like the last paragraph another twist which I also guessed and felt truly nothing but contempt for. The whole thing was just this weird contradiction of feeling very, very young and very immature and shallow, as if it was written by a teenager for other teenagers, but then it also has these incredibly graphic scenes which make it obviously an adult book. So just absolutely none of it worked. It got 1 star from me, and I'm so glad I don't own a copy of this book. But next, I read Our Dark Duet by V.E. Schwab. This is the 2nd book in a duology about this city where violence literally creates these paranormal monsters. And we follow 2 characters from opposite sides of the city, and so they deal with these monsters very differently. Earlier this year, I reread the 1st book in preparation for finally reading this one. And the 1st book, This Savage Song, it just didn't hit as hard the 2nd time around as I was hoping, to be honest. It felt quite stretched out and muddled at times, and like its only real purpose was to set up the world and the characters for whatever would happen in this book. Tragically, this one didn't really deliver either. I've given it 2.5 stars, and I think by the end I was just a bit sick of feeling disappointed in the world and the story. The characters, in comparison to the first book, just felt quite muddled and as if they'd changed a lot in a way that didn't gel for me, and so I just kind of lost interest in them. I enjoyed the story of this one, particularly the first half, I think, more than this Savage Song. This Savage Song started very, very slow and then sort of got more intense and then was at a fever pitch by like the last couple of chapters. This one really gets straight into the action, but I think that's mostly just the benefit of it not being the first book in a series. There's not need for much setup, you can just jump straight into the action. So yeah, this one started pretty fast already, and then about halfway through, just the plot and the structure fell to pieces. There is so much toing and froing. At one point in the last couple of chapters, I'm pretty sure they go between these two major locations literally 5 times, and I think this is all meant to take place in a night or like 24 hours, and I was reading it and I was like, what is happening? Why was this not sorted out very early on in the plotting stage? And then once we're in the home stretch and we're barreling towards the end at a breakneck pace already, there were just not enough pages to wrap everything up, even at the speed we were traveling at. And so at the very end, it didn't really feel like the story finished or concluded. It just kind of ended, and it did feel anticlimactic, and I was disappointed. I would definitely not say I considered this a satisfying conclusion. I think another problem with this was that it was just trying to do a lot and trying to examine and talk about and discuss so many different themes and topics, much like the first book was, about the nature of humanity and, you know, what really makes a monster. And that's interesting in theory, but it was too much crammed in to a plot that wasn't entirely sound in the first place. And by the end, I was just kind of sick of reading such a depressing book about monsters, to be honest. Which is a shame, because it was the monsters that I was most interested in. So yeah, a somewhat disappointing conclusion to a story it took me 8 years to finish. But things did get better from that point onwards in my reading. So next I picked up Across the Greengrass Fields by Shauna Maguire. This is the 6th book in the Wayward Children series, which is a fantasy novella series about these children who have gone through a magical door into these magical and bizarre and dangerous worlds, but then inevitably come back into our real one. And so the installments alternate between following a character as they have gone into their magical world and had their adventures there, and then every other book is set sort of in the present time, in our world, mostly in this school that's been set up to help the children deal with the trauma of this. And I definitely tend to enjoy the ones not set in the school, but the ones that follow children on their individual adventures. Luckily, this was one of those. In this one, we are following Reagan, who is a girl who's really into horses, and then the magical world she finds her way into is full of centaurs and unicorns and other animalesque creatures. So I really enjoyed the fairy tale vibes and elements of this, and the fantasy world I thought was really cool with, yeah, the centaurs and unicorns and kelpies and fauns and all that kind of stuff. And I actually wish we'd spent more time there. The structure of this book is basically the first half is you're following Reagan up until the point she gets to the door, and then the second half is her in the fantasy world. But I wish kind of the division had been a bit more like 1/3 and 2/3. I like that I can never really guess what's going to happen next, and how these stories are always able to surprise me in that way. But that does mean that sometimes your mind will start to wander, and you'll have an idea that actually you end up liking more than what does happen in the story. So for me, that was the very ending of this I didn't really like. It felt quite anticlimactic, and there was this like reveal quite towards the end, which just was so implausible. I thought it was ridiculous. But I did still enjoy this, and I've given it 3 stars. Next, I read A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, which I found in a secondhand bookshop at Standon House. This is a fantasy story told from the perspective of one of Dracula's wives, Constanta. I do consider myself a little bit obsessed with the story of Dracula, so I was really excited to pick this up and see what happened. And I'd heard loads of really, really amazing things about it too. And I thought this was pretty good and very compelling and interesting, but there was nothing about it that made me go, wow. It has quite lyrical writing, which I really enjoyed, but I noticed there were a lot of times when the narrator would just tell you things and then not really describe or demonstrate them at all. So the plot of this story spans multiple centuries, but there are a lot of instances I noticed of the narrator saying things like, oh, we had a good few decades in Venice, and then they don't describe any of the good times or really anything about Venice. And then later on they would say like, oh, he, Dracula, he started lots of arguments and we didn't like it, but then like not describe any of the arguments or the aftermath or anything like that. And once I spotted this, it really felt like it was happening like every other page, and I was enjoying it, and I just wanted there to be more. This isn't super long, it's just under 300 pages, and so I wish it had been longer and just been a little bit more fleshed out. And my final impression, unfortunately, is the epilogue at the end of this book. I thought was just like completely unnecessary, and I didn't really appreciate it, and I think it would have been better without it, to the point where I'm not actually sure if it's part of the original story or if it was originally published without the epilogue and I have like an edition with an extra chapter. It's not very obvious, but yeah, the epilogue was I think quite unnecessary and slightly, I don't want to say it ruined the book for me, but it would have been so much stronger without that like last chapter. So I did enjoy this, and I'm very, very glad I read it, and I've given it 3 stars, but it's not groundbreaking. And then finally, I did a slightly spur of the moment reread of The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nevo, which I had forgotten almost everything about, other than I really enjoyed it. This is the first book in this series, the Singing Hills cycle, which can actually be read in any order, but it's set in this Asian-inspired fantasy world, and our main character is Cleric Chi, whose job it is to go around and collect stories and collect histories. In this one, we are hearing about a former empress who was from the Northern Kingdom and then came down to marry the emperor, and everything that ensued from there. And this was just such a lovely read. It's the writing style I really like. It's very slow and lyrical and like syrupy at times, but it also does a really good job of building tension very, very slowly, because if you're paying attention, you will already know how the story of this empress will end, and you're just waiting to see how it gets to that point. The world building in this is so tantalizing because it's such a short novel and there's not much space for a lot of world building, but it's so woven expertly into the story itself, and so every now and then a character will reference a person or a place or a legend, and that is actually my favorite way of world building. I don't love it when there's a massive dump of information and the story like suddenly grinds to a halt for this massive pause as we're explained how everything works and who everyone is. I much prefer it when it's subtle and intrinsic, and that's exactly what this book does. So once again, I ended up really, really liking this. I've given it 4 stars, and it really has just made me want to read endless stories set in this world. So luckily for me, I have the 2nd and 3rd books on my shelf, which are also ripe for rereading, and I have the 4th book on my TBR shelf. So I'll also show you what I'm currently reading. So I have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is centered on a son's relationship with his mother and the very complicated and emotional and traumatic history they share. It's written very beautifully, like very poetically, and I am liking it, but it was just quite a lot. So I took a little bit of a break, but hoping to finish this soon. And I am also halfway through rereading, actually, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero O'Connell. And gang, I'm not loving this. I think I tricked myself into thinking I enjoyed it the first time round years ago, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do that a second time. So those are all the books I have finished recently. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one.